Guys, my name is Brad Anderson. I am the broker and owner of White Rock Realty, and we are based in Texas. So I have agents across the state of Texas in Houston, DFW, San Antonio, Austin, El Paso, and really any other city you can imagine in Texas, as well as Oklahoma and New Mexico. And so I do a lot of these videos primarily because I think it's better to have agents out there that are educated specifically on contracts than to not. And I find that the sources for getting this kind of information is rather lacking, unfortunately. And so I like to do this. I like to provide this kind of content. If you are in Texas, then you're probably familiar with the Champion School of Real Estate. Some of you may have gotten your original education there. I am an instructor there. And so I have a heart for teaching and for educating and for really watching agents grow their business. And so I wanted you to be able to put a name with a face before we kind of launched into today's content. Also, let me just share my screen. And because this is information about contracts, I want to just be sure that okay, so what you're looking at here is a list of contracts that you would need for a listing, for a buyer representation, and the leasing process. So whether you represent a landlord or a tenant. And if you want this list, I am more than happy to share it with you. Go ahead and reach out to me either via email or via text. At the time of this recording, March of 2026, I have all of the most current forms that you'll need, right down to the most recent one for this unrepresented customer showing form. So that's a relatively new form. So because the subject is contracts today, I want to make sure that you all have the right contracts for each of these kinds of transactions. And so again, I have provided a list of documents and forms that you will need for each of these transactions. If you want that, go ahead and reach out to me at this information. The content that we're going to be going through today is centered around timelines within three important contracts that we use in Texas. This is normally a 1-hour CE class that I teach. And if you want to get on the distribution list for other CE classes that I do, they are all free. So you just need to hop on and you'll get an extra hour or more of free CE credit. Reach out to me at this information as well and let me know if you want to be on that distribution list for whenever I do these CE classes. You can guarantee that you can hop on one once a month because that's what I provide my agents. And again, if you like any of this stuff and your brokerage isn't providing this, we do, and we might be a better fit for you. And so just reach out and we can chat about that. But today's content is really about the timelines and time-related things within our contracts. And much of our value as realtors for our clients is making sure these timelines are met and things don't go sideways. So we're going to review three contracts today. One is the 1-to-4 family residential contract. The other is addendum for the property being in a mandatory homeowners association, and then the third party financing addendum. So let's take a look first at the 1-to-4 family residential contract. So this thing's 11 pages long. There is a lot of stuff in here. The only thing I'm going to be talking about today is the time sensitive areas. And the first one we come to is in paragraph 4 as it relates to leases. So as the contract says, there are 3 possible leases that may exist for a piece of real property. They are either a residential lease, so you have a renter in there, a fixture lease, so think of solar panels or water softeners, um, uh, security systems, things that are bolted in that can't be taken with you, but that are paid for via a lease. And then the last one is natural resource lease. So much of our time sensitive commitments rely on the executed date. So the first highlight in yellow here relates to just leases in general. And it says, after the effective date, seller may not, without buyer's written consent, create a new lease, amend any existing lease, or convey an interest in the property. So it's going to be helpful to just go right to the executed lease portion. All right, and it's on page 9 of the 11-page contract. And you'll notice that there's a spot for a signature for a buyer and a spot for the seller's signature. And then whoever touches it last fills in this executed date. And that's critical because everything, not everything, but most everything within these 11 pages is keyed off of this one date. And so let's go back to where we were. And so it says after the effective date, which we just looked at, seller may not, without buyer's written consent, create a new lease, amend an existing lease, or convey any interest in the property. So once that contract is signed, if there is a tenant in there or any other kind of lease, the owner cannot renegotiate a lease or do anything other than keep it in place. And there are addendums for whether or not there are leases in here that speaks to, well, okay, the buyer now knows there's a lease on the property. What is going to happen? Does the buyer inherit it? Is the seller going to get rid of it before ownership is conveyed? What? But in this case, for this conversation, I just wanted to point out the first spot where we look at a time-sensitive issue. The next is still within this area, but it relates to natural resource leases. So these are your mineral leases, right? So for those of you that may not know, when someone takes possession of a property, they actually own the home, the dirt underneath it, and then everything up to the sky and into infinity, okay? So natural leases, natural resource leases pertain to anything underneath the soil that may be of value. And usually we're talking about oil and gas. And so there are a couple of options here. If there is a lease, which is very common in Texas, the first option is seller has delivered to the buyer a copy of that lease. But the second is seller has not delivered a copy of that natural resource lease, and the seller will provide to the buyer a copy of that lease within 3 days. From what? After the effective date. And then usually when there is a do this or this happens, which is a great example of, it says that the buyer has some recourse if that thing isn't met. And so in this case, it's about the resident or the natural resource lease. And it says if the seller doesn't get that lease to the buyer within 3 days, buyer may terminate the contract within X days after the date the buyer receives the natural resource lease, and the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. Okay, so if by chance the buyer does receive it, they have X amount of time to get out of the contract if they don't like something within that lease. Okay, now paragraph 5 talks about the delivery of earnest money and option fee. So the earnest money is a subset of the down payment that is given as a symbol of liquidated damages should the buyer default. Okay, it is not consideration. It is simply just a portion of the down payment that they would normally bring to closing, whereby the buyer says, if something happens and I can't perform and it's my fault, you get this money. Okay. Most agents deem 1% of the sales price as a rule of thumb. Other agents do more, some agents do less, but that's kind of what that is. An option fee is a non-refundable, usually smaller amount, that they also give the seller for the right to get out of the contract for no reason whatsoever between the executed date and some date into the future. It could be the next 5 days, could be the next 7 days, could be the next 10 days, whatever the two parties agree on. And usually it's in that period that the buyer gets their inspections done. And if something pops up, they ask for repairs, things of that nature, right? But that's not really what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about when does that have to be delivered, okay? So it needs to be made payable to the title company. And it says, clear as crystal, within 3 days after the effective date, buyer must deliver to, and this is the blank for the title company or escrow agent, at this address, whatever you put in here, the earnest money and blank as the option fee. All right. Now, it does talk about down here if the buyer wants to deliver additional money at a later date. You also put in here that they have a certain amount of days to do that. So this is the most common question that I get as a broker with regards to how to count these days. So because today's subject revolves around time sensitivity, I think it's important to go through that exercise. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So what you're looking at here are 3 examples where people get confused the most. So let's say that you execute the contract on a Friday. The contract says, within 3 days after the effective date, buyer must deliver earnest money and option fee. It doesn't say business days, so it is calendar days. Okay, so if they execute on a Friday, this is day 0. So this would be day 1, day 2, and day 3. So they have, I mean, the title company is not going to be open Saturday and Sunday, right? So they have until end of day on Monday, all right? Literally the end of the literal day. So 11:59 p.m. Now, you and I both know that a title company is going to close around 5 or 6. You better get that earnest money in, an option fee in by the time the title company closes. Okay, so point to note here, 2 things. Friday is the executed date. That is day 0. Day 1 is Saturday. Day 2 is Sunday. Day 3 is Monday. The second thing to remember is that always, 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 this means calendar days. Okay, now, what happens if you execute on a Thursday? Well, Thursday is day 0. Friday is day 1. Saturday's day 2. So they have until technically Sunday by the close of business to get that earnest money in. But hang on. Let's go back. It says here, if the last day to deliver earnest money option fee or the additional earnest money falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, the time to deliver that earnest money, option fee, or additional earnest money as applicable is extended until the end of the next day that isn't a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. So let's go back to our example. Whoops. So in this example, the third day is a Sunday. So they have until this day, by end of day, to get in their earnest money and option fee. Okay. Now, let's take a look at and also a common occurrence. Let's say that you execute on a Friday. And as I mentioned in this example, this is day 0. This is day 1, day 2, but day 3 is a legal national holiday, isn't it? Right? So technically, not technically, literally, they have until Tuesday to get that earnest money and option fee in. Okay? Because the third day was going to be a national holiday. So as the contract says, if that's the case, then the time is extended until the whatever day comes next that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. Okay? All right. Termination option for nominal consideration, the receipt of which seller acknowledges and buyer's agreement to pay the option fee within the time required. Seller grants the buyer an unrestricted right to terminate the contract by giving notice of termination to the seller within, and here's where you put in the time-sensitive day. And again, usually that's 5 days, 7 days, 10 days after the effective date of this contract. Now, this is the only time where the end of that day, and it doesn't matter what day it falls on. If it's a Saturday, Sunday, legal holiday, even if the last day of the option period is Christmas Day, it doesn't matter. If you represent the buyer, you have to terminate, if that's the buyer's wish, by 5 p.m. on the last day of that option period. Okay? So similarly, if you execute on a Friday and you have a 5-day option period, well, Friday is day 0. So this is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. Whoops. Day 5 by 5 p.m. Okay, so in this case, no title company is involved, but it doesn't matter. You still have to give notice by 5 p.m. on the last day of the option period. And so, again, counting these days is critical. Day 0 is always on the executed date. This is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5 of a 5-day option period. So you have until, in this case, Wednesday by 5 p.m. to deliver that notice. An email is fine. You just need to have proof that it was sent by 5 p.m. by the last day of the option period. Okay. And it says failure to timely deliver the earnest money. If buyer fails to deliver the earnest money within the time required, seller may terminate the contract or exercise seller's remedies under paragraph 15. And paragraph 15 of the contract is where it stipulates that either party can take legal action. And then it says, or both, by providing notice to the buyer before buyer delivers the earnest money. Okay. What that means is if the buyer doesn't deliver the earnest money or option fee by the time prescribed, the seller can get out. Now, if they forget and they deliver it, let's say the very next morning, and the seller never objected, well, then the contract carries on as if they delivered it on time. Okay, that's earnest money. Failure to deliver, the option fee. If no dollar amount is stated as the option fee, or so if this is left blank, right here, if that's left blank, or if the buyer fails to deliver the option fee within the time required, buyer shall not have the unrestricted right to terminate this contract under this paragraph. Okay, so this is the probably the most critical, time-sensitive thing that we have in here. So it's important as a buyer agent to understand how the counting of days works and all that good stuff. Okay, now you'll see spread out throughout our contracts this expression that says time is of the essence for this paragraph and strict compliance with the time for performance is required. Whenever you see that expression in a contract, then that means there is a date that's assigned to that, right? Which we just went through, and there is. All right. So this is probably one of the most important areas you should know about. All right, then you come down to paragraph 6, and under commitment, this deals with the title policy. And it says that within 20 days after the title company receives a copy of the contract, notice it doesn't say 20 days from the executed date, seller shall furnish to buyer a commitment for title insurance, which is also called a commitment, and at buyer's expense, legible copies of restrictive covenants and documents evidencing any exceptions in the commitment, which are known as the exception documents. So I always pause here and say it's very common for in cash transactions for the close to be rushed, and because there is no lender involved, and so naturally it's not going to take as long, and that's logical. But what you have to realize as a realtor is that it's already baked into the contract that the title company has almost a good 3 weeks to get this title commitment to the buyer. And the research of title and providing all the exceptions is not something that you want to rush. Okay. Now, what does it say if that doesn't happen? Well, in this second highlighted paragraph, it says if the commitment and exception documents are not delivered to the buyer within the specified time, the time for delivery will be automatically extended up to 15 days or 3 days before the closing date, whichever is earlier. If the commitment and exception documents are not delivered within the time required, buyer may terminate this contract and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. All right, so there are some definite time constraints on title commitment delivery. Next, we go into the delivery of a survey. All right, and in our current contracts, there unfortunately is not an option for buyer has already received the survey. I wish there were, because a lot of times the agent will upload the survey into the MLS, and I wish that there was an option for that, but there's not. So the options are this: delivery of the survey, right, must be made by a registered professional land surveyor acceptable to the title company and the buyer's lender. And so the first option is within X days, and this is something that you as the agent would put in, within X days after the effective date of the contract, seller shall furnish to buyer and title company seller's existing survey of the property and a residential real property affidavit or declaration promulgated by the Texas Department of Insurance, and buyer shall obtain a new survey at seller's expense no later than 3 days prior to closing if the seller fails to furnish within the time prescribed both the existing survey and the affidavit or declaration. So what is the affidavit or declaration? It's the T47 document, they call it, or T47.1, which is just a declaration. The affidavit has to be notarized. The declaration does not. That basically is just a sworn statement on behalf of the seller that says this survey is current and nothing has changed. Okay. So then it goes on to say, if the title company or buyer's lender doesn't accept that existing survey, buyer shall obtain a new survey at the, and then you mark either, who pays for that, is it at the seller's expense or buyer's expense, no later than 3 days prior to closing. All right, so there's a lot of time-bound things that are in there. So it just kind of depends on what situation you're in. But as long as nothing's changed, such as didn't rip out a pool and put in a patio, or didn't change the boundaries, fence didn't change, and that survey is still good, then this option should suffice. The second option is, within X days after the effective date of this contract, buyer may obtain a new survey at buyer's expense. Buyer is deemed to receive the survey on the date of actual receipt or the date specified in this paragraph, whichever is earlier. If buyer fails to obtain the survey, buyer may not terminate the contract under paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum because the survey was not obtained. So this is an example where the buyer, at the buyer's expense, is going to get a new survey. And this might be because the seller has an old one, or they don't want to pay for a new one. Regardless, this is the buyer's responsibility and the buyer's expense. But so this is a to-do on the buyer. So they have to do this within X amount of days that you put here. But it says buyer is deemed to have received the survey on the date of the actual receipt or the date specified in this paragraph, right? Which is whatever X days after the effective date is. So don't put in something like 3 days. It's going to take longer to get a survey done than 3 days. I would put anywhere between 18 to 28 days, to be honest with you. All right, but check with your broker on what he or she might recommend. And then the last option is within blank days after the effective date of this contract, seller at seller's expense shall furnish a new survey to the buyer. Okay, and then you come down to the objections part, and it says, so this is where the buyer can object to anything within the title commitment. Okay, and so it says the buyer must object the earlier of either the closing date or blank days after the buyer receives the commitment and exception documents and the survey. Okay, so it says if buyer fails to object within the time allowed, that will constitute a waiver of the buyer's right to object. Okay, and then it goes on to say, well, if the buyer does object, provided the seller is not obligated to incur any expense, seller shall cure any timely objections of the buyer or any third-party lender within 15 days after the seller receives the objections, and that is known as the cure period. All right, so again, seller's not obligated to do this, but if they can cure it and they've agreed to cure it, then they have 15 days to do that. So what might be an example? A common example would be the survey comes back and the neighbor's fence is a foot over onto the property that the buyer is about to purchase. And it's, the seller may have known about it. He or she knows their neighbors. It's nothing more than a conversation with the neighbor to move the fence, and they have 15 days to do that. Okay. In that example, the seller is not going to incur any expense. They're just going to have a conversation with their next door neighbor. Okay. So it then goes on to say, if the objections are not cured within the cure period, buyer may, by delivering notice to the seller within 5 days after the end of the cure period, terminate this contract and the earnest money is refunded, or waive the objections, right? So the buyer just says, yeah, I know I thought it was a big deal, but it's not, so I'm just going to go ahead and forget it. If buyer does not terminate within the time required, buyer shall be deemed to have waived the objections. If the commitment or survey is revised or any new exception documents is delivered, buyer may object to any new matter revealed in the revised commitment or survey or new exception documents within the same time stated in this paragraph. So if you put 3 days here, then they got 3 days to object to anything new that pops up. All right, any exceptions, any commitment, any survey. All right, so there is a lot there that you have to keep track of. So the first major hurdle we talked about that you all need to be aware of is the delivery of earnest money and option fee. This is the second. All right, when the title company sends over the title commitment and exception documents, you need to be able to know how to read that document. If not, sync up with your title company to get an explanation and have the client there, because you don't want to be giving your client third-hand information. You're not a party to the contract, your client is, so they have to be present when that explanation is given. But it has to be crystal clear that there is nothing wrong with the survey or the title commitment. Okay. All right. So the next time-bound thing is somewhat of a new addition to the contract, and it talks about statutory tax districts. So this is going to be your municipal utility district, or a MUD, as they call it, or a property improvement district, or a PID, or any other entity above and beyond your property taxes that are usually set forth by the county, that is going to require the buyer to pay something extra each month. All right. And it says here, if the property is situated in a utility or other statutorily created district, providing things such as water, sewer, drainage, or flood control facilities and services, Chapter 49 of the Texas Water Code requires the seller to deliver and buyer to sign the statutory notice relating to the tax rate, bonded indebtedness, and standby fee of the district, and this is where it gets important, prior to the final execution of this contract. So if you are a listing agent, it is imperative that you understand that the home you're listing is in one of these districts, and that you load those documents into the MLS so the buyer can sign them before that executed date on page 9 is given. Okay, so a lot of people miss this, partially because it's kind of buried in the contract and partially because it's new. Okay. All right. Then it talks about similarly in this subparagraph 6, that buyer hereby acknowledges receipt of the foregoing notice at or before the execution of a binding contract for the purchase of the real property described in paragraph 2 or at closing of purchase of real property. So another time-bound thing. All right, and then similarly under also under paragraph 6, required notices. The following notices have been given or are attached to this contract. For example, utility, water, drainage, public improvement districts. It says, seller's failure to provide applicable statutory notices may provide buyer with remedies or rights to terminate the contract. Okay, so delivery of these things is really, really important. The next talks about the seller's disclosure and the overall property condition. So there are a couple of choices. When it comes to that seller's disclosure, if you represent the buyer, if the listing agent was on their game, then this would have been uploaded into the MLS. And if that is the case, by the way, that is deemed to have been accepted by the buyer. Now, if you, the agent, don't notice it until a couple of days later, that's going to be a problem for you. All right. If it was uploaded into the MLS, it is deemed to have been accepted by your buyer. And that is the first choice. 7B1, buyer has received the notice. Now, 7B2 gets into some interesting stuff. So it says buyer has not received the notice. So they haven't received the seller's disclosure. So you're going to put in within X days after the effective date, seller shall deliver the notice to the buyer. If buyer does not receive the notice at all, buyer may terminate this contract at any time prior to the closing, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. It then goes on to say, if seller delivers the notice, buyer may terminate this contract for any reason within 7 days after the buyer receives the notice or prior to the closing date, whichever first occurs, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So if you're a listing agent, you don't want to give a buyer this option, right? But let's say that this case does exist and your buyer hasn't received the seller's disclosure. Well, what if you put down here, they have 3 days to get it to you, and you gave your buyer up here a 5-day option period. Let's just say you gave them a 5-day option period. And then you put in 3 days after the effective date to get to the buyer the seller's disclosure. And what if the seller doesn't get that to your buyer until day 3? Well, as this paragraph says, from the time they receive it, they have another 7 days of free option period to get out of the contract for whatever reason. All right. And it all hinges on the delivery of this seller's disclosure. So this is important whether or not you're a buyer's agent or a listing agent. Okay, because it has really big implications if it's not delivered in time. All right, under paragraph 7F, completion of repairs and treatments. So basically, they have, if a buyer asks for repairs on behalf of the seller has until the closing date to get those done. If they don't, then this is kind of what this paragraph talks about. So it says, unless otherwise agreed in writing, seller shall complete all agreed repairs and treatments prior to the closing date and obtain any required permits. The repairs and treatments must be performed by persons who are licensed to provide such repairs or treatments, or if no license is required for that profession, people that are just engaged in that business, all right, need to be hired. In other words, the seller can't do them themselves. So seller shall provide buyer with copies of documentation from the repair person showing the scope of work and the payment for the work completed, and at seller's expense, arrange for the transfer of any transferable warranties that come from a result of doing those repairs, and they got to do that before closing. Then it says, if seller fails to complete any agreed repairs prior to closing, buyer may exercise remedies under paragraph 15, which is the I might be suing you paragraph, or extend the closing date up to 5 days if necessary for seller to complete the repairs and treatments. Okay, so 99% of the time, this goes off without a hitch. The repairs are done a couple of days, if not a week before closing, and your buyer does a final walkthrough and to confirm that the repairs were done. Okay. All right, closing. This is probably the most important date that exists in the contract. Let me say this. The closing date is not a suggestion. The closing date is the closing date. All right. It says the closing date of the sale will be on or before whatever date you put in there. Okay. Or within 7 days after the objections are made under paragraph 6D, and that was the objections to the title commitment. Okay. All right, buyer's possession. Buyer shall take delivery to buyer, seller shall deliver to the buyer possession of the property in its present or required condition, ordinary wear and tear accepted, and there's two choices, either upon closing and funding or according to a temporary residential lease form promulgated by TREC. And so this is important, and it is time bound because most people will take possession of the property upon closing and funding. But it says closing and funding. And so closing is when people come in and sign the documents. Funding is when the money gets from the buyer to the seller. And if it's a Friday and people aren't closing and signing documents until 3 p.m., there's a chance that that money won't get to the seller in time for the buyer to be able to move in. So think about the problems that may cause. Movers have been scheduled. Locks have been changed. Utilities may have been shut off. All those types of things, only to find out that because we're closing at 3 o'clock on a Friday, the buyer can't legally take possession of that home, even though the documents have been signed, because the money hasn't gotten to where it needs to go. Okay, so that's a big deal, and you might find yourself in a situation where you have to explain that. All right, and then it goes on to explain that at the time seller delivers possession of the property to buyer, seller shall deliver to buyer written information containing all access codes, usernames, passwords, and applications buyer will need to access, operate, manage, and control all the smart devices in the home, and terminate and remove all access and connection to the improvements and accessories from any of seller's personal devices, including but not limited to phones and computers. All right, and this would even trickle down to the keypad on the entrance of the door. All right, so seller has to reset that to whatever, so that all the seller's codes are gone. Okay. All right, casualty loss. We get a lot of weird weather here in Texas, right? So paragraph 14 talks about what happens when that happens. And so it says if any part of the property is damaged. So remember, property is land, improvements, fixtures, and the actual home. So that means the fence, it means the driveway, it means the lawn, it means the actual home. If any part of that is damaged by fire or other casualty, after the contract is signed, the seller shall restore the property to its previous condition as soon as reasonably possible. But in any event, by the closing date, right? So if a big hailstorm comes through and the roof has to be replaced, the seller has to return that roof to its original condition by the closing date. So what if they can't? Well, it says if the seller fails to do so due to factors beyond the seller's control, buyer may terminate the contract and get their earnest money back, extend the time for the closing or performance up to 15 days, and the closing date will be extended as necessary, or just accept the property in its current condition and close as designed. Now, if it is something of this magnitude, then it would have to be a cash purchase because, well, not necessarily though. What I'm getting at is that if it's uninsurable because it was in a fire or the roof was demolished, then it's going to be difficult for the buyer to get insurance anyway. Okay, so although it's an option, it's probably not a good one for the buyer to just waive their concern about the roof being damaged or the home being damaged by fire. Okay, so paragraph 18C relates to termination of the contract. So, and the paragraph is entitled Demand. So upon termination of this contract, either party or the escrow agent may send a release of earnest money to each party, and the party shall execute counterparts of the release and deliver same to the escrow agent. If either party fails to execute the release, either party may make a written demand to the escrow agent for the earnest money. If only one party makes written demand for the earnest money, escrow agent shall promptly provide a copy of the demand to the other party. If escrow agent does not receive written objection to the demand from the other party within 15 days, escrow agent may disperse the earnest money to the party making the demand, reduced by the amount of any unpaid expenses incurred by are incurred on behalf of the party receiving the earnest money, and escrow agent may pay the same to creditors. If escrow agent complies with the provisions of this paragraph, each party hereby releases escrow agent from all adverse claims relating to the dispersal of the earnest money. So this will happen. I'm going to shorthand this for you. This occurs when a termination of the contract occurs and it's not real black and white as to who gets the earnest money. And the person that usually insists that they get it sends over a release of earnest money, and the person that doesn't think that it should be given to that person is usually the person that says, I'm not signing that document. And this paragraph says that if that happens, then the person that demands the earnest money reaches out to the title company and makes a formal demand, and the clock starts ticking. And the title company will then send a written record of that to the other party, and they've got 15 days to respond. If they don't, I know the paragraph says the escrow agent may release the earnest money. They usually do not, because they don't want to play judge and jury with regards to who should get that earnest money. But this is how the contract reads, and there is a time-bound nature to this. So why does this even matter? Well, whenever you terminate a contract, there's two documents that have to be signed by both parties. I take that back. The termination of contract does not require dual signatures, but that is written notice by one party to the other that the contract is being terminated. It is not fully terminated, though, until that earnest money is delivered back to whoever each party agrees that it should be delivered to, because the buyer has what's known as an equitable interest in that property. They have money tied up that is tied to them buying that property. And if that money isn't accounted for, then as the release of earnest money says, the release of earnest money says that once each party signs this, then this then absolves each of those parties from any further legal action. Okay, and so without that second signature, title is still open on that property, buyer can get their money back, and the seller can't technically relist it. Okay, so it's important that that kind of gets put to bed before things move on. Okay, all right, and then we've already hit upon this when we first spoke, which is the executed date of the contract. And again, this is on page 9, and this is the date from where everything is keyed. Okay, so those are the time-bound things for the 1 to 4 family residential contract. We now move on to the third-party financing addendum, and this document is a 2-pager. It's used when your buyer gets a loan to purchase a property. So the very first paragraph says type of financing and duty to apply and obtain approval. It goes on to say buyer shall apply promptly for all financing described below and make every reasonable effort to obtain approval for the financing, including but not limited to furnishing all information and documents that their lender asks them for. So this is the point where I usually say, especially if this is a first-time home buyer, they may not understand the level of urgency that is involved in this process. And what I always say to my realtors to tell their clients that if your lender is asking you for something, be it a paycheck stub or a bank statement or something that they need to provide the loan, assume that they wanted that yesterday. Okay? The buyer has to rely on so many other outside entities to acquire that home that are not in their control. And that's unfortunate. So the best they can do is comply quickly with what the lender is asking them for. All right, so this first paragraph, while it does speak a little bit to urgency, it does not give specific dates by which to get all this done. It just says buyer shall apply promptly, right? And they'll make every reasonable effort to obtain approval, but it doesn't give you anything time bound, right? Until you get to paragraph 2. So not to gloss over paragraph 1, but all this is just relative to whatever kind of loan they're going to get, right? Then it comes down to the time-bound portion of this document. In paragraph 2, approval. So there's 2 ways that a buyer can get approved for acquisition of this home. And the first is the approval of the actual loan. And it says approval for the financing described above will be deemed to have been obtained when buyer approval and property approval are met. Time is of the essence of this for this paragraph, and strict compliance with the time for performance is required. And so let's talk about that. What's time bound about it? Well, let's go down to paragraph 2A, buyer approval. This means everything they're going to have to do to financially get qualified and checked off to buy this home. Okay, we'll get into property approval in a second. But buyer approval says this contract is subject to buyer obtaining buyer approval. If buyer cannot obtain buyer approval, buyer may terminate this contract within an X amount of days after what? The effective date of the contract by giving seller notice of termination and a copy of a written statement by the lender setting forth the reason for the lender's determination. So this is relatively new. So no longer can a buyer just simply use this as an excuse to get out of a contract because they got cold feet. All right. If the lender doesn't provide a written notice as to why that buyer was turned down, it's not valid. Okay, because that would be mortgage fraud, right? If the or if the lender falsifies a document and says, yeah, we couldn't get them approved, but that's really not the case. And no lender is going to do that. Okay. So it basically goes on to say that if the buyer terminates this contract under this paragraph, all right, they're within their days, and I usually put 21 here because in Texas it's typically a 30-day close, and 3 weeks is going to be the time that's needed, to be honest, with regards to getting approved. By the time all the paperwork gets passed back and forth. But if they choose to do that, if they can't get approved and the lender can back that up, then and they terminate within that time frame, then buyer gets their earnest money back. Okay, if they do not exercise that right and the seller doesn't hear from them, then it's assumed that the buyer has approval and they can no longer cancel the contract because of this. Okay. Now, it then goes on to talk about the property approval. So while this is not time bound, it is germane to canceling the contract. And it's one thing for a buyer to get financial approval, but it's another thing for the house to be approved. So if the house has a roof that's 20 years old and insurance can't be met, or one of the most common ways for property to not meet approval for a lender is for it not to appraise for the sales price. So if the home is priced at $400,000 and the appraisal comes in at $380,000, the buyer can get out. Okay, so you don't need to write anything separate about the appraisal process. It's already included in this contract. Okay, but the one thing that is time bound is property approval, or I'm sorry, buyer approval of the loan. Okay, and that is all there is to the third party. And so lastly, if the home is in a property association, property owner association, or HOA or POA, your buyer needs to know what those rules are that govern that HOA. And why would that be a big deal? Well, if the buyer wants to purchase the home and never intends to live in it and wants to rent it out and use it for investment purposes, the HOA may not allow that. Had a situation with an agent where that was the case, and they thought that they were in the clear, and because there were other rental properties that were up for lease in that same subdivision, and the buyer goes about the business of getting this property, and only to find out, too late, by the way, that, yeah, the homeowners association allows rental properties, but you have to live in that property for at least a year before you do that. Okay, so they worked it out, but this is a great example of don't assume that in that example that just because there's other rental properties in the area that you can rent yours out too without knowing the full scope of the restrictions that the HOA puts forth. Another might be it's strictly prohibited that any business be run out of a home. It might be strictly prohibited that you can't work on your car in your driveway. All sorts of things that a buyer may or may not consider a deal breaker. So the time-bound elements of this addendum is really the delivery of those documents. And let me just tell you that they're usually over 100 pages long. So it is not your job as the agent to pour over all 100 pages and point out things that might be of concern to your client. That's your client's job. Your job is just to make sure that they are delivered within the time specified in these three options. And the first is within X days after the effective date of the contract, seller shall obtain, pay for, and deliver the subdivision information to the buyer. If seller delivers the subdivision information, buyer may terminate the contract within 3 days after the buyer receives the subdivision information or prior to closing, whichever occurs first, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. Now, the buyer does not have to have an issue with anything in these documents. It just says, it just says, once the buyer receives this, they got 3 days to get out of the contract. Doesn't have to be because of this, but this is a trigger for the buyer to take a look at what the rules might be and say, I don't like this one, so I'm out. Okay. The second option is within X amount of days after the effective date, the buyer shall obtain, pay for, and deliver a copy of the subdivision information to the seller. If buyer obtains the subdivision information within the time required, buyer may terminate the contract within 3 days after the buyer receives the subdivision information, and earnest money will be refunded to the buyer if they decide to get out. Third option is buyer has received and approved the subdivision information before signing the contract. Buyer either does or does not require an updated resale certificate. If the buyer requires an updated resale certificate, seller, at buyer's expense, shall deliver it to the buyer within 10 days after receiving payment for the updated resale certificate from buyer. Buyer may terminate this contract and earnest money will be refunded to the buyer if the seller fails to deliver the updated resale certificate within the time required. So the resale certificate is the 1 or 2 or 3 page document that outlines the health, the financial health of the HOA. Okay. And then the other time-bound element of this document is in paragraph B, material changes. If the seller becomes aware of any material changes in the subdivision information, seller shall promptly give notice to buyer. Buyer may terminate the contract prior to closing by giving written notice to the seller if any of the subdivision information provided was not true, or any material adverse change in the subdivision information occurs prior to closing, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So what could that possibly be? Let's say that the contract was signed on April 1st, due to close on May 1st. On April 15th, a huge hailstorm comes through and damages common areas of the subdivision. All right, not your roof necessarily, but other things that the subdivision governs. And the subdivision then comes out a week later and says, we're going to have to assess an extra charge to you as the owners to cover this cost. Seller becomes aware of it. Seller tells the buyer that is going to be considered a material change, and because it's extra money that the buyer didn't intend to expend, and the buyer can get out based on that. Okay. All right. So that concludes this video on some of the time-sensitive things within our contracts. A lot of time obviously was spent on the longer contract, being the 1 to 4 family. And just as a reminder, I have a list of all the contracts that you would ever need for a buyer, a seller, and a lease. And if you want a list of those, go ahead and reach out to me here and I'll be glad to send it to you. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want to be put on a list to know when I'm teaching these CE classes, also reach out and specifically mention that, and I'll make sure you get included. All right, but that concludes this video, and I hope you found it helpful.